global partnership. States' human rights obligations require them to cooperate toward the progressive realization of human rights globally. And this clearly should include adequate financing of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage by those who can best afford it. At the COP26 climate negotiations, my office and many partners will be strongly advocating more ambitious, right-based, and inclusive climate action. And I particularly urge the Council member states to demonstrate leadership in this respect. Nor can we overlook the heightened risk exposure of women and girls to climate and environmental harms have also been economically, socially, and culturally constructed over decades and generations. Coupled with the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and girls, UNDP assessed that by the end of this year, there will be 118 women aged 25 to 34 living in extreme poverty for every 100 men. And by 2030, that will increase to 121 women living in extreme poverty for every 100 men. This is untenable by any human rights measures. Madam President, human rights law protects the right to participation, access to information, access to justice. It guarantees all people the rights to benefit from science and its applications, and to share equitably in the benefits of development. And, and it requires we protect the basic conditions necessary for life, including a safe and stable climate, clean air and water, healthy biodiversity and ecosystem, and a non-toxic environment. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is grounded in human rights, is a roadmap for solutions that can help to heal our planet and ensure that humanity can thrive. The Secretary General's call to action for human rights commits all UN bodies to work together to assist states to address these and other crucial issues for our environment. Our office will continue to work with our partners throughout the UN system and beyond to urgently support this work. The call to action has served as a critical impetus for deepening OHCHR's partnership with UNEP, and I'm glad to announce that we will be launching a joint environmental rights program in the coming month to enhance protection of environmental human rights defenders and civic space, integrate human rights, including the right to a healthy environment, into all relevant negotiations and UN processes, and help build national capacity to promote and protect human rights. The treaty bodies also have an important normative role in this area. Following the powerful joint statement on human rights and climate change made by 5 committees in 2019, the committees on the right of the child will be reaching out to states, experts, and hundreds of children to prepare a general comment on children's rights and the environment. The Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is also pursuing work on general comments on sustainable development and on land. National human rights institutions are also responding to the urgent need for action. At its annual conference in December of last year, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions focused on climate change and committed to concrete actions to support right-based climate action and improve monitoring and reporting on these issues. My office and others under the umbrella of the call to action are working closely with NHRIs to report the realization of these commitments. We will also continue our work to help states advance a human rights economy that invests in health, social protection, and other core economic and social rights, and supports sustainable development to benefit people and their planet. And we will further strengthen our work on business and human rights at the regional and country levels, working with businesses and affected stakeholders to build capacity to address risks to people from harmful business activities, including those related to climate change and environmental degradation. Madam President, alongside this discussion of the urgent environmental crisis facing humanity, I also draw the Council's attention to a number of specific and fast-moving situations. In Chad, a formal roadmap for transition adopted by the transitional government in July includes provisions for a national dialogue, a new constitution, and constitutional referendum, significant legal reforms, and national elections by September 2022. It also refers to a planned mapping of the human rights situation in Chad as a step towards the adoption of a national human rights policy and plan of action. Reference is also made to the establishment of a commission to verify illegal or arbitrary detentions and to ratification of international human rights treaties. These are encouraging signals in a country that faces severe and increasing conflict and climate related threats, including violent extremist activity and violent clashes between farmers and herders. The office stands ready to assist the authorities to implement the human rights commitments. In Mali, following the coup d'etat in May, the second in 10 months, violent extremist activity and severe human rights violations and abuses continue, continue unabated, spreading also to previously unaffected areas in the southern part of the country. Between January and June, at least 948 civilians have been killed, injured, and abducted by armed groups or disappeared by Malian defense and security forces. The impunity afforded the perpetrator of such crimes is a significant contributor factor in this deteriorating situation. Like the Secretary General, I'm following closely the situation in Guinea, where I deplore that yet another non-democratic transition of power has been inflicted on the country's people. Like the people of Mali, Chad, and indeed every state, the people of Guinea deserve sound governance by representatives they have selected to address their needs and concerns. I emphasize that the new de facto authorities in Guinea at all levels and in all sectors of public service, including the military, must respect the country's obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. I am concerned by significant deterioration of the human rights situation in the Central African Republic. From February to June 2021, our staff documented a 76% rise in incidents, including killings, which were mostly perpetrated by armed groups. The number of documented victims rose by 88% compared to the same period in 2020. Long-standing patterns of impunity are a major concern in the country, due in part to weak national institutions and lack of independent and functioning justice systems. Some courts have resumed and magistrates have been redeployed, but insecurity continues to force many judicial personnel to flee for safety reasons. The Special Criminal Court is operational, however, and requires stronger financial support. In Haiti, last month's earthquake has added even more suffering to the country's extensive human rights crisis. I encourage all actors involved in reconstruction efforts to focus on the need to build greater resilience for the country, with sustainable progress on economic and social rights, with, and with special attention to women and girls. The assassination of President Moise illustrates the country's rampant insecurity. We are particularly concerned about continuing attacks against judicial personnel and human rights defenders. In the Czech Republic, I welcome legislation adopted last month that enables women and men to receive compensation having been sterilized unlawfully and without consent. For more than 45 years and until 2012, hundreds of people, particularly Roma women, were forced into sterilization. I trust this important acknowledgement will be a harbinger of greater efforts by the government to combat discrimination against Roma people. I know with great interest China's new National Action Plan on Human Rights 2021-2025, which was released this month, including its focus on climate change, environment, digital privacy, and responsible business practice. I look forward to exploring it for possible areas of engagement and cooperation. I regret that I'm not able to report progress on my efforts to seek meaningful access to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In the meantime, my office is finalizing its assessment of the available information on allegations of serious human rights violation in that region with a view to make it public. Indian authorities' restrictions on public assembly and frequent temporary communication blackouts continue in Jammu and Kashmir, while hundreds of people remain in detention for exercising the right to the freedom of expression and journalists face ever growing pressures. Ongoing use of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act throughout India is worrying, with Jammu and Kashmir having among the highest cases in the country. While I acknowledge the government's efforts to counter terrorism and promote development in the region, such restrictive measures can result in human rights violations and foster further tensions and discontent. In Nepal, take early steps to restore the independence of a National Human Rights Commission through a transparent process in line with the Paris Principles. The authorities' commitment to prioritize amendment of the transitional justice law is an opportunity for fresh approaches to revitalize the process in consultation with victims and in line with international standards. In Iraq, failure to hold accountable the perpetrators of human rights violations against demonstrators and others voicing criticism facilitates the recurrence of such crimes. This impunity and continued violent attacks against people who have criticized assassination, abductions, torture, and other severe violations raise serious concerns ahead of next month's election. Our recent joint report with UNAMI outlines credible accounts of torture in many places of detention, raising concerns that the safeguards which should prevent torture are routinely not respected. Torture is not only illegal and unprincipled, it also feeds violent extremist narratives. And I urge urgent action to put an end to this situation. I also recommend swift and full implementation of the Yazidi Survivors Law passed in March, which provides for reparations, care, and rehabilitation for the survivors of the targeted crimes committed by the ISIL group, which may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. 7 years later, many Yazidis remain missing, and survivors still face immense challenges, with many remaining in displacement camps. In the Kurdistan region, UNAMI has noted continued impediment of freedom of expression and media freedoms, including prosecutions of journalists and on dubious charges and without due process. In Tunisia, where the office has worked for a decade to support the people's commitment to democracy, justice, and dignity, the president's suspension of parliament and dismissal of the prime minister raised institutional questions for the effective protection of human rights in the future. While efforts to combat corruption are important, independent judicial proceedings with full respect of fair trial guarantees are necessary to resolve such allegations against individuals. Additionally, I encourage any reform measures to fully respect the freedom of separation of powers. Freedom of expression, including the right to criticize the authorities, and media freedoms are fundamental to any sound society and should not be eroded. The office will continue to assist transitional justice measures and will work to uphold the aspirations of the Tunisian people to economic and social rights and fundamental freedoms, including by calling on the international community for continued support. In Lebanon, conjoined social, economic, and political crises are having serious and deepening human rights impact. Electricity and fuel shortages are seriously impeding essential services, including the functioning of hospitals, schools, and water facilities, utilities. Poverty continues to rise. In March, 78% of Lebanese population was estimated to be living in poverty, with an estimated 36% in extreme poverty. The price of basic food and beverage increased by 670% between April 2019 and April 2021. In this context, inter and intracommunal tensions are a growing concern. Moreover, while Lebanon should be commended for its welcome to large numbers of Syrian refugees, they now face a particularly dire humanitarian situation. I am concerned by continued reports of detentions and deportations of Syrians without adequate due process and non-refoulement safeguards, and by the hardship and vulnerability faced by migrant workers, 75% of whom are women, exacerbated by the kafala sponsorship system. In the occupied Palestinian territory, I deplore continued and increasing instances of excessive or entirely unwarranted use of force against Palestinian civilians by Israeli security forces. So far this year, 54 Palestinians, including 12 children, have been killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank, more than double the figure for all of 2020. Over 1,000 people have been injured with live ammunition. The regular resort to lethal force is clearly at odds with international standards. I'm also deeply concerned by crackdowns on dissent by the government of the State of Palestine in recent months. During protests that followed the shocking killing of activist Nisar Banat in June, Palestinian security forces used unjustifiable force against peaceful demonstrators. One of my staff who was monitoring the protests was among the many who were beaten. Arrest of dozens of activists in August suggests that repression is deepening. I call on the authorities to ensure the safety of protesters and to respect fundamental freedoms. In Swatini, I'm concerned by reports of excessive and unwarranted force against people who have peacefully demonstrated for democratic reforms in recent months. In addition to deaths and beatings, protests have also been met with mass arbitrary arrests and detentions, including of children. I urge meaningful investigations and accountability for these human rights violations. More broadly, I'm concerned about legislative restrictions of the civic space and the use of terrorism laws against critics and protesters. The continued detention of protesters without charges is also disturbing. Great respect for fundamental freedoms would encourage more trust for the authorities, including in the context of government efforts towards a national dialogue. There should be clear assessment of the root causes of this crisis, including inequalities and shortfalls in economic and social rights. My office stands ready to provide support. In Zambia, I welcome last month's peaceful transfer of power, as well as the new government's stated commitment to strengthening democracy, human rights, and the rule of law with a diverse and inclusive approach. Policies that are grounded in human rights, including civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development, will assist the country to overcome critical issues such as poverty and inequalities that should be addressed. Excellencies, last week, the Secretary General issued a focused plan to address the crisis that face our planet and secure greater peace and well being for our peoples. The common agenda outlines an effort of solidarity and long term thinking that fulfills our principles and can rebuild people's trust in the future. Its 12 commitments hold out hope for a world that instead of lurching from crisis to calamity, manages to navigate and resolve threats with the guidance of principle and the exercise of foresight and solidarity. The choice is ours. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Madam High Commissioner for the presentation of her oral debates, updates, and report. We will take a short technical break before we commence the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I will now give the floor again to Madam High Commissioner for a continuation of her oral updates and reports to the Council. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Señora Presidenta,
Madam President, Excellencies, I am honored to present the report on the human rights in Venezuela and cooperation between my office and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela based on the Human Rights Council document HRC 45452. 2 years after my team arrived in the country, we are continuing to expand our areas of cooperation and our access and presence. In that spirit, Just last Friday, we agreed on renewal of the Letter of Understanding, doubling the number of human rights officials in the country from 6 to 12. This cooperation will continue to be based on strengthening national mechanisms for protection and access to justice and technical assistance to the legislative agenda, implementation of the recommendations by the various human rights mechanisms, and the recently announced police and judicial reforms. Over the past year, we have provided technical assistance in various areas, including assessing compliance by public institutions with the Minnesota and Istanbul protocols. We are drawing up protocols which are adapted to provide greater accountability and protection of the right to life and physical integrity. My office has also assessed and provided recommendations to address concerns related with preventive detention facilities. We are ready to support the ongoing police and judicial reforms to contribute to compliance with human rights standards. Of the cases shared through our cooperation mechanisms, 152 detainees have been freed since June 2020. I reiterate my call for the freeing of all persons arbitrarily detained, and I welcome the acquittal of Julio Bratar. We also continue to support the authorities in their preparation for the upcoming Universal Periodic Review and promoting ratification of all the main human rights treaties, such as the Convention on Enforced Disappearance. In the past 2 years, my team has carried out 8 missions to various states of the country and visited 24 detention facilities to provide specific recommendations on the human rights situation. Some of those are contained in the report I present today. This report also gives a general vision of the situation with economic, social, and environmental rights. It also describes how the existing humanitarian and economic situation was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the sectoral sanctions, which further limit access to basic services. I reiterate my call for the sectoral sanctions to be lifted. I recognize the efforts made by the government to address the challenges caused by the pandemic. However, like in other places, this has meant transferring scarce resources from other essential medical treatment, causing further scarcity in the health sector and leaving health professionals and other vulnerable groups particularly at risk. In view of the lack of vaccine doses available to date, I would like to recall all those present that access to vaccines is a human right and must be considered a global public good. Excellencies, despite the economic and social situations launched to mitigate the situation and some progress made in recent years, incomes continue to be extremely low, insufficient to guarantee an adequate standard of living and affecting access to food and education. I encourage a strengthening of access to basic services, particularly for the most vulnerable groups, and with particular attention to equal access and non-discrimination, guaranteeing transparency, participation, and public monitoring. I am concerned at the lack of public data to monitor and report adequate gun public policy. In this context, the role of civil society is all the more essential and must be protected. I am also concerned by the additional restrictions and the ongoing reports of intimidation and criminalization of human rights defenders and trade union leaders because of legitimate activities. I encourage dialogue initiatives to be established in order to overcome the current deadlock regarding the elections for the autonomous universities. I trust that the political dialogue underway can lead to significant solutions and lead to greater progress for the protection of human rights. I also welcome the commitment of the authorities to my office and trust that we can continue further to develop our cooperation. Thank you.
Madam President, Excellencies, I present the update pursuant to Resolution S31/1, adopted at the Council Special Session on Afghanistan on the 24th of August. Since that discussion, the people of Afghanistan have faced violence and yet further profound upheaval. On 26 August, a harrowing suicide attack claimed by an ISIL's group killed at least 142 civilians gathered outside Kabul airport in the hope of leaving the country, including children, and injured at least 250. In addition, 13 US military personnel were killed, as well as at least 28 Taliban fighters. 3 days later, a US drone strike claiming to target ISK members killed 10 civilians. I'm concerned by reports of civilian casualties and human rights abuses as a result of a fighting in Panjshir Valley, as well as the growing hardship caused by the dire humanitarian situation there. Facing deepening humanitarian and economic crisis, the country has entered a new and perilous phase, which many Afghans, profoundly concerned for their human rights, particularly women, ethnic, and religious communities. Although the Taliban has issued public statements purporting to grant amnesty to former security personnel and civil servants, prohibiting house to house searches, and assuring women's rights under Islamic law, information that we have cross checked to the extent possible and which we assess to be well founded indicates that practice on the grounds have often contradicted these stated commitments, that implementations has also varied greatly between provinces. My office has received credible allegations of reprisal killings of a number of former ANSF personnel and reports of civilians who worked for previous administrations and their family members being arbitrarily detained. In some cases, the officials were released, and in others, they were found dead. In addition, we have received multiple allegations of the Taliban conducting house-to-house searches looking for specific government officials and people who cooperated with US security forces and companies. These searches have reportedly taken place throughout the city of Kabul, as well as Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, Gardes, Maimana, Samangan, and elsewhere. A number of similar incidents have affected UN staff who report increasing attacks and threats. Deeply troubling information also reaches us regarding Taliban raids on offices of some non-governmental organizations and civil society groups. Importantly, and in contradiction to assurances that Taliban would uphold women's rights over the past few weeks, women have instead been progressively excluded from the public sphere. In many areas, they are prohibited from appearing in public spaces without a male chaperone. In numerous professional sectors, women face increasing restrictions. Taliban representatives have limited girls' access to education, with girls over 12 prohibited from attending schools in several locations. The Taliban has dismantled many departments of women's affairs across Afghanistan, taking over their offices, equipment, and gaining access to sensitive files and threatening their personnel. Women's civil society groups have been accused of lewdness and spreading anti-Islamic ideas in their communities. Women have been, in some instances, instructed to stay in their homes purportedly for their own safety because Taliban forces were not, I will quote, not trained to deal with women. End of the quote. A growing number of protests have been taking place in Kabul, Angor, Ghazni, Takhar, Herat, Nimroz, and Balkh provinces. Taliban forces have reportedly used increasing violence against protesters and journalists, including live ammunition, batons, and whips. On 7 September, 2 men were shot and killed, and 7 others wounded during a protest in Herat. That same day in Kabul, reports indicate that protesters were beaten and that several women and up to 15 journalists were detained. On 8 September, during a protest in Kabul, the Taliban detained at least 5 journalists and severely beat 2 of them for several hours. All Afghans are entitled of their fundamental rights and freedoms. Moreover, Afghan women and girls have equal rights to men and boys. Their access to all basic services, including education, as well as their active and meaningful participation in all spheres of public, economic, social, and political life, is essential for the development of Afghanistan, and the United Nations will maintain the utmost vigilance in this respect. Madam President, I'm dismayed by the lack of inclusivity of the so called caretaker cabinet, which includes no women and few non Pashtuns. The overwhelming majority of Afghans do not seek further decades of conflict and division. They long for peace and stability in a country where they and their children can prosper and where they can contribute to a governance system that encourages meaningful participation of women and youth and brings together the country's ethnic and religious communities. I'm also profoundly alarmed by the escalating humanitarian crisis. I call on all states to assist the United Nations and other actors with the provision of humanitarian assistance to the country, while remaining mindful that the provision of such assistance may be rooted in the respect and protection of human rights. I welcome the focus on these urgent issues afforded by the Secretary General's high level meeting this afternoon. I continue to urge all states to use their influence with the Taliban to encourage respect for human rights with special attention to the rights of women and girls, as well as members of ethnic and religious minority communities. Reprisal killings and other human rights abuses should be met with immediate accountability, including for individuals ordering and directing such attacks. The existence and operation of an independent national human rights institution is also critically important. These steps are not only a matter of fundamental human rights, they are central to promoting genuine reconciliation among all actors, which is vital to Afghanistan's future. They provide the Taliban with the opportunity to demonstrate whether they are in fact committed to a well-being of all Afghans across the country. The rights of all Afghan refugees must be upheld. I acknowledge the efforts of numerous states to evacuate and relocate, among others, at risk human rights and women's rights defenders in urgent need of protection. I also emphasize the need to support neighboring countries that are sheltering large numbers of uh, Afghan refugees. I reiterate my appeal to this Council to take bold and vigorous action commensurate with the gravity of the crisis by establishing a dedicated mechanism to monitor the evolving human rights situation throughout the country and keep the Council closely apprised of developments. In the meantime, my office, acting under my mandate in Resolution 48/141, will continue to work to the full extent of our capacity to monitor the rights of the Afghan people and assist wherever possible in protecting and advancing those rights. Thank you, Madam President. Now I will proceed with the oral update of Nicaragua in Spanish. Excellency,
Excellencies, in my last update, oral update before this council, I voiced warning about the concerning human rights situation in Nicaragua, particularly as regards the exercise of political rights in the elections of the 7th of November. The people of Nicaragua must be able to exercise their right to vote free from intimidation, violence, or administrative interference. People wishing to do so must be able to freely submit their candidacies, and voters must be able to participate in campaigns. It is also vital that the media be able to cover electoral campaigns of different candidates free from interference or undue restrictions imposed upon them by the authorities. None of this is happening in Nicaragua. Between the 22nd of June and the 6th of September, my office documented the arbitrary detention of 16 people, including political leaders, human rights defenders, business leaders, journalists, and campesino peasant farmer leaders and students, in addition to a further 20 detainees from the 28th of May. This group includes 6 men and 1 woman who have publicly stated that they were aspiring to the presidency, while a pre-candidate to the vice president is being accused while free. The large majority of these people remain deprived of their liberty and have been so for up to 90 days, being held incommunicado, some in isolation, without any official confirmation as to their whereabouts from the authorities to their families. On just the 31st of August, the Public Prosecutor's Office began to authorize visits. Many of these arbitrary detentions, particularly those of women, present factors which could be considered to be torture or ill treatment. The Public Prosecutor's Office informed that the majority of accusations against these persons were for conspiracy to undermine national integrity and other crimes allegedly linked to the implementation of cooperation funds. According to information received, no family members were able, or independent press were able to attend the hearings, and in the majority of the cases, there were no lawyers permitted either. Despite having submitted various habeas corpus appeals, we have no information as to any judicial decision regarding the detainees. Moreover, in August, the Supreme Electoral Council arbitrarily revoked the legal personality of the party Citizens for Liberty, invalidating their candidacies without anyone being able to present any defense. This fact, together with the cancellation of a further 2 political parties last May, eradicated any potential option for candidacies of the main opposition groups. Excellencies, attacks on freedom of expression have intensified. On the 12th of August, the newspaper La Prensa denounced the fact that it was no longer able to print its papers due to the seizing of paper by the customs authorities. One day later, the National Police Force and the Public Prosecutor's Office raided their facilities, their offices, and seized material goods and subsequently detained their Director General. Threats on the part of the Public Prosecutor's Office against various journalists and media workers have led to many Nicaraguans leaving the country to seek protection. My office has documented 12 cases, while civil society have counted more than 30. Similar patterns of repression are being recorded against human rights defenders or those exercising social and political leadership roles, lawyers, medical staff, NGOs, among others. Between the 28th of July and the 26th of August, the authorities ordered the closure of 45 non-profit organizations. These included 6 international cooperation organizations, various medical associations which voiced criticism as to the government response in the face of the pandemic, and women's organizations, among others. Official figures indicate that in June and July alone, more Nicaraguans requested appointments to seek asylum in Costa Rica than in the first 5 months of 2021. My office also received reports that on the 23rd of August, at least 9 indigenous persons had been found dead, victims of an attack related to a land dispute in the Sauni As territory in the autonomous region of Costa Caribe Norte. Indigenous leaders had denounced to the police the threatening situation 10 days prior, requesting their intervention. I remind you that murders and attacks related to land disputes in this same area have gone unpunished since January 2020. I welcomed the submission in July on the part of the government of Nicaragua of their first voluntary national report on progress on the SDGs. However, we remain concerned at the lack of official information on COVID-19 infections and deaths. This prevents us from properly assessing the state of the pandemic in Nicaragua, as was flagged by the Pan American Health Organization. Excellencies, given this deteriorating situation in Nicaragua, it is essential that the government once again guarantee the full enjoyment of civil and political rights of all Nicaraguans, that they put an end to persecution of the opposition, press and civil society, and that they immediately and unconditionally release the over 130 persons detained since April 2018, according to civil society sources. Moreover, institutions must ensure that impunity does not continue as regards serious human rights violations and abuses committed in that period. Victims need to be given access to justice and comprehensive reparations. The solution to this crisis requires the participation of all sectors of society and must be based on human rights norms and standards. This is the path set out in the very many recommendations that I have issued over recent years. I urge this Council to consider all measures within its power to promote and protect human rights in Nicaragua. You may count on the full availability of my office to assist in these efforts. Thank you very much indeed.
Now I will do my final oral report on Sri Lanka. Distinguished President, Excellencies, I am pleased to update the Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka and the trends and issues identified in my last report. I acknowledge the input sent by the government in preparation for this update, and I note the President's statement in June that the government is, and I will quote, committed to work with the UN to ensure accountability, end of quote, and will implement, I will quote again, necessary institutional reforms, end of quote. I look forward to seeing concrete actions to this effect, in line with the recommendations that have been made in our report and by various human rights mechanisms, and my office stands ready to engage. I also encourage the swift and public release of reports of the National Commission of Inquiry that was appointed in January 2021, which I understand will complete its mandate by the end of this year, so that its work and recommendations can be assessed. The current social, economic, and governance challenges faced by Sri Lanka indicate the corrosive impact that militarization and the lack of accountability continue to have on fundamental rights, civic space, democratic institutions, social cohesion, and sustainable development. A new state of emergency was declared in Sri Lanka on 30th of August, with the stated aim of ensuring food security and price controls amid deepening recession. The emergency regulations are very broad and may further expand the role of the military in civilian functions. The office will be closely monitoring their applications. I know with interest the President's recent meeting with some civil society leaders, and I encourage broader dialogues and step to open Sri Lanka civic space. Regrettably, surveillance, intimidation, and judicial harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, and families of the disappeared has not only continued but has broadened to a wider spectrum of students, academic, medical professionals, and religious leaders critical of government policies. Severe peaceful protests and commemorations have been met with excessive use of force and the arrest or detention of demonstrators in quarantine centers. New regulations of civil society groups are being drafted, and it is widely feared that they will further tighten restrictions on fundamental freedoms. I urge that the draft be made public to allow the broadest possible discussion. I am concerned by developments in judicial proceedings in a number of emblematic human rights cases. They include the Attorney General's decision not to proceed with charges against former Navy Commander Wasanta Karanagoda in the case of the enforced disappearances of 11 men in 2008 and 2009. Despite various inquiries, the victims of the Eastern Sunday bombings in 2019 and religious leaders continue to call urgently for truth, and justice, and a full account of the circumstances that permitted those attacks. The President's recent pardon of a former member of parliament, Dominda Silva, who was convicted for killing a politician in 2011, also risks eroding confidence in the rule of law and judicial process. I'm deeply concerned about further death in police custody and in the context of police encounters with alleged drug criminal gangs, as well as continuing reports of torture and ill treatment by law enforcement officials. In March, new I will quote, de-radicalization, that's the quoting, regulations were issued that permit arbitrary administrative detention of individuals for up to 2 years without trial. I note that Supreme Court has issued an interim stay order on their enforcement while it considers fundamental rights petitions to challenge the decree. The government has also prescribed or listed over 300 Tamil and Muslim groups and individuals for alleged links to terrorist groups. In June, 16 prisoners who have been convicted under the Problematic Prevention of Terrorists Act and who were nearing the end of their sentences were pardoned. An advisory board has been established to which detainees under the Act can apply for their cases to be reviewed, and I urge a speedy resolution to these long-standing cases. The government has reaffirmed its intention to revisit the Act and establish a cabinet subcommittee for this purpose. However, I'm deeply concerned about the continued use of the Act to arrest and detain people. Lawyer Hessas Hizbullah has now been detained for 16 months under the Act without credible evidence presented before a court. Likewise, Hanaf Hazem, a teacher and poet, has been detained without charge since May 2020. I urge an immediate moratorium on the use of the Act and a clear timeline be set for its comprehensive review or repeal. A national policy for reparation was approved in August, and reparation payments and reconciliation programs have continued. The Office of Missing People has also continued to operate with a sixth regional office open in Kilinochchi, but it needs to inspire confidence among victims. I stress again the importance of transparent, victim-centered, and gender-sensitive approaches and that reparation programs must be accompanied by broader trust, truth, and justice measures. I note also that last month, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions decided to initiate special review of the National Human Rights Commission to determine its compliance with the Paris Agreement principles, indicating its concerns about the appointment process of the Commission and its effectiveness in discharging its human rights mandate. Against this backdrop, my office worked to implement the accountability-related aspects of Resolution 46/1 has begun, pending recruitment of a startup team. We have developed an information and evidence repository with nearly 120,000 individuals' items already held by the UN, and we will initiate as much information gathering as possible this year. I urge member states to ensure the budget process provides the necessary support so that my office can fully implement this work. I encourage Council members to continue paying close attention to developments in Sri Lanka and to seek credible progress in advancing reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. Thank you very much.
I thank Madam High Commissioner, and we will take a short break before we proceed with the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Nicholas Koumjian, Head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, for his presentation. He will present from the podium. The floor is yours.
Madam President, Excellencies, it is an honor to present the third annual report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. In accordance with its mandate from this Council, the mechanism continues to collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of the most serious international crimes and violations of international law committed in Myanmar since 2011, and to prepare files focusing on the criminal conduct of persons responsible. Tragically, serious crimes and violations of international law continue to be committed in Myanmar. The long history of impunity continues to impact the lives of Myanmar's people. Men, women, and children from diverse regions and ethnic groups are suffering. 4 years since the military's 2017 clearance operations in Rakhine State, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya remain living in temporary shelter in Bangladesh, their lives on hold, hoping to return to homes, many of which have been burned and bulldozed. Since the military seized power in February of this year, the mechanism has received reports on the use of unjustified force against peaceful protesters, arbitrary arrests, torture, enforced disappearances, and killings. Thousands of people have fled their homes in various regions, devastating the economy of Myanmar and straining the resources of neighboring states. More than ever, there is a need to end impunity and to break this cycle of violence. To date, the mechanism has collected over 219,000 information items related to post-coup events. Our initial analysis indicates that these crimes are both widespread and systematic in nature. The preliminary evidence shows that about 1,000 civilians have been killed, including in Yangon, Naypyidaw, Bago, Mandalay, Magwai, and Sagaing. The evidence shows security forces acting in a coordinated manner across different regions, systematically targeting specific categories of persons, such as journalists and medical professionals. Many thousands have been detained without due process of law. Under international law, crimes such as killings and arbitrary detentions, when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, are crimes against humanity and thus fall within our mandate. The mechanism is working to verify and analyze the available evidence concerning these events and to identify individuals who bear criminal responsibility. Madam President, in the past year, the mechanism has established a secure, state-of-the-art information management system. We've engaged in outreach to key stakeholders, recruited personnel with a diverse range of expertise and specializations, and collected and processed over 1.4 million information items. We are mobilizing additional resources to enhance our capacities, especially those related to the analysis of open source and financial information. We are pursuing innovative strategies for collecting evidence, which we consider essential, given that the authorities in power in Myanmar have denied us access to crime scenes and potential witnesses. We are committed to ensuring that the mechanism always upholds the core principles of independence and impartiality. We pursue accountability irrespective of the race, ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation of the victims or the perpetrators. We place particular attention on the investigation of sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children, because while very prevalent in conflict situations and devastating to societies, these crimes are often underreported and under-prosecuted, in criminal justice systems. These investigations require particular skills and sensitivities, and our recruitment and training policies reflect our determination to build such capacity. We seek to always ensure the safety and privacy of victims, witnesses, information providers by emphasizing the confidentiality of our work, ensuring the security of information, and obtaining informed consent from those we contact regarding how we will use any information that they share. Our mandate is to collect evidence and build case files that can facilitate criminal prosecutions in national, regional, or international courts. Many challenges remain. Building files on serious international crimes is a complex, time-consuming process. It requires proof to the very high standards necessary for criminal convictions. Since the mechanism is not a court, accountability for the crimes we investigate depends upon finding competent authorities willing and able to hold the perpetrators accountable in fair proceedings. We will then share our evidence, as we have begun to do for proceedings in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Madam President, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to all those who have helped with the mechanism's efforts to collect and verify evidence, including victim and survivor groups, civil society organizations, businesses, and many brave individuals. With the support of this Council, we will continue to do all we can to collect evidence of the most serious international crimes, so that one day there will be justice for the victims from Myanmar, and all will know that impunity for such crimes will no longer be tolerated.
I thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to Mr. Kumjian and to make comments on the report. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We welcome